The other new feature that the Americas Journal has is a feature called dialogues, in which we allow authors to publish sections of interview transcripts between themselves and the interlocutors with which they work in their published work. This gives us an opportunity to look inside the conversations that later are synthesized in particular scholars' publications and often do not see the light. The two authors who provided those transcripts for us for the journal obviously are not going to reproduce those conversations in symposium format today. And so we asked them to create short papers around the issues that came up in the dialogues that they contributed to the journal. And our first of these two speakers today is Alejandro Madrid. He is professor and department chair at Cornell University's Department of Music. He's the author and editor of more than a dozen books, including Tania Leon's Stride, A Polyrhythmic Life, which is out at the end of November in 2021. He's also the author of In Search of Julian Carrillo and Sonido 13 from 2015, the co-author of Danzón, Circum-Caribbean Dialogues in Music and Dance from 2013, and Music and Mexico from 2012. Madrid is a recipient of the Dent Medal from the Royal Musical Association and the Premio de Musicología Casa de las Américas, among several other national and international awards. He edits the book series Currents in American Music, the book series Currents in Latin American and Iberian Music for Oxford University Press, and co-edits the journal 20th Century Music.
Right. So I want to thank Susan Thomas for the invitation to be a part of this first number of the revamped version of the journal. And I want to say a little bit about what this is about. I think this engages two types of borders. One is the border of this particular, this is a chapter from a book that is coming out about Tania Leon that deals with the border of Blackness and Latinidad and representations of Blackness within the context of someone who is an Afro-Latino. So that's, I guess, the first border. The other border is that this is actually a border in terms of my research. I started writing this book, and when I found out all these issues of race and ethnicity that were so central to how Tania Leon describes herself, especially in relation to the different notions of Blackness that we have in the United States and in Latin America, I sort of use this as sort of the connecting point or the bridge between two different projects. So my new project, one of my new projects, is actually about the border between Blackness and Latinidad in terms of sound and music and accent. So this is going to be part of that project. So on April 28, 2018, the Hostos Center for the Arts and Culture in the Bronx presented an event called I'm in Constant Transit, a two-hour-long series of community activities. And after a resource fair and visual arts workshop hosted by Ivory Núñez Medrano at the center's gym, the event concluded with a concert by the Dream Unfinished, an orchestra that dedicated the concert to the music of Tania Leon. The Dream Unfinished is an activist orchestra whose mission is to use classical music to open spaces for community conversations about racial and social justice. The event was part of the Lincoln Center Education's Borough Link series, which are devoted to the presentation of quote-unquote free world-class performances, family workshops, and exhibitions in the neighborhoods of the 5 boroughs of New York City. The concert portion of the event was billed as quote-unquote an interactive exploration of the colorful music and groundbreaking career of composer and conductor Tania Leon. The concert portion of the event was billed quote-unquote an interactive exploration of the colorful music and groundbreaking career of composer and conductor Tania Leon. It began with Yoon Lee, the Dream Unfinished founder and executive producer, distributing pieces of paper to the audience and asking them to write down how they describe or identify themselves. The answers were varied. Some people chose to label themselves in relation to ethnicity as Latinos or Blacks. Others prefer to talk about themselves in relation to other people as daughters, husbands, or friends. Yet others decided to use their nationality as a label of identification. A discussion followed of how we label ourselves always relationally in relation to other people or certain social expectations. This was the preamble to a conversation about Tania Leon's choice not to use labels to describe herself. Lee spoke about how throughout her career, Leon has rejected terms such as Black composer, woman composer, or even Afro-Cuban music in favor of more fluid and strategic ways of highlighting the impermanence and transitivity of the human experience. It is telling that Tania Leon was the dedicatee of this event. She is an artist who started her career in Harlem and Brooklyn, who came out of these communities, but has always returned to give back to them. And she is a champion of artists and musicians who struggle in the margins of the American mainstream. She is always willing to use her artistic and academic prominence to help shift the spotlight to them. In sum, Tania Leon is a role model, a leader of community work, an unrelenting critic of boxes and labels, and a composer going through the process of canonization, as the discussion of historiography in the next section will show. Tania Leon has a long presence in music historiography, having appeared in books and textbooks about American music, African American music, Latin music, and Latin American music as early as 1977. While some of the earliest texts about her mention her in relation to African American music scenes in New York, she has also been represented as Afro-Cuban, Latina, and Latin American. Each of those characterizations dwells on a particular aspect of her life, musical production and her networks of belonging, but mostly her presence on these texts betrays deeply ingrained aspects of racial desire in the American imagination. By co-opting, racializing, and reducing the composer experience in the name of identity politics, this characterization not only do violence to Leon's vision of herself as a complete subject, the repetition in the musical and social networks they circulate in, even if in the name of representation, also perpetuate and further reinscribes in the professional sphere the type of violence Leon has experienced in her everyday life as an immigrant woman of color in contemporary American society. Here I want to mention the work of Mark Gital, who's actually written about that in relation to other American composers, but especially about Tania Leon. Today, I wish to focus on one particular case regarding a polemic about whether to represent Leon as an African American or not, or not as an African American, that came out of Helen Walker Hill's book, From Spirituals to Symphonies, African American Women Composers and Their Music, from 2001. Since I believe this discussion sheds light on the uses of all other labels when trying to make sense of this composer. When Helen Walker Hill was researching her book, From Spirituals to Symphonies, she invited Tania Leon to participate. Leon ultimately declined to be included because she thought that the project, the focus of the project on Black women composers was too narrow. Although there is no section in the book devoted to Leon, Walker Hill quoted the composer at the beginning of the book to explain her absence. Quote, "I'm tired of all our labels. I'm not a Black composer. I'm not a Black conductor. I'm not a woman conductor. That the fact that I am in this physical costume does not describe my energy, does not describe my entity. My chosen purpose in life is to be a musician, a composer, a conductor. This is the way I am making my contribution to mankind." End of quote. This statement may seem like a contradiction to those who know the centrality of a number of African-American artistic and cultural projects to Leon's development as a composer and musician. To name a few, Her work at Dorothy Maynor's Harlem School of the Arts in the late 1960s, which led to become the founding music director of Arthur Mitchell's Dance Theater Harlem. Her collaborations with Marian Anderson in Spiritual Suite from 1976, which in turn opened the door for her to lead work as music director of The Wiz on Broadway from 1978 to 1982. Her work with the Society for Black Composers in the late 1970s in programming music of composers of color with the Brooklyn Philharmonic, and her collaborations with Alvin Ailey and the American Dance Theater. Regardless, a reaction to her ideas against tokenism and the perceived contradiction mentioned above filtered through Walker Hill's book and informed the impressions of the authors represented in the book, as well as those of some of the composers who actually accepted to be part of the book, even when sympathetic to Leon's objections to be tokenized. Mary Watkins, for example, expressed that Leon's concerns were due to the fact that, quote, her experience is not that of one growing up African-American, end of quote, an opinion shared and expanded by Walker Hill herself in the book's introduction, where she states that the great majority of composers in her study, quote, are proud to be identified as African-American women, and they are aware of the unique and highly political history of Black women in the United States, a history that is not likely to have been absorbed or experienced by those who, like Tanya Leon, have grown outside of this country. Almost all of them have their roots in a Black American world that is unknown to most whites and common knowledge to most Blacks, end of quote. It is well known that Leon objects to be identified as a Black composer as much as she objects to be identified as a woman composer. But I would contend that her reasons have nothing to do with not understanding the experiences of Black women. In fact, I would argue that it is precisely through her experience and deep understanding of this quote unquote Black American world, as narrated through the artistic collaborations discussed in the earlier parts of the chapter, as well as the everyday life details that I will discuss later, what allowed her to become not only an American composer, but ultimately an American individual. So what I'm contesting is, what I'm arguing is that her experience as an African-American, as a Black woman in the United States is actually what led her to become an American citizen in the, or an American, culturally an American citizen. It is telling that when asked about how she felt as a member of an all-Black dance company, Leon asserted, and I'm talking about Dance Theater Harlem here, quote, "It is just that it was a different idiosyncrasy, a different way of thinking, a different way of behaving. I have never avoided looking in the eye. I never looked down. And that was something I noticed a lot among people of color at the time. They didn't look in the eye, especially if the other person was white. And I understand that, I understand them perfectly well," end of quote. This statement embodied the source of, as well as a response to, the misunderstandings Leon's position on race often generates. In Cuba, Leon grew up in a working class, multiracial neighborhood where being Black was not a problem. This is not to say that there is no racism in Cuba, but rather that Leon's experience was different. Quote, "My brother and I," Leon explains, "did not live during that period when Cuba had the clubs for people of color where my parents met. I went to a school with many students who looked like me. At the conservatory, nobody ever made me feel like I was different. And the same thing happened at the commerce school." She studied accounting before she moved to the United States. Leon concludes, quote, "In my school, there were people of all colors. We were all together in the same classroom. We played together. I didn't live all the tragedy of racism," end of quote. As a child, protected by her family, especially by her grandmother, Mamota, and her mother, Mima, who were very adamant about keeping her from experiencing the racism they had lived through in their lives. Nevertheless, Mamota was also interested in her knowing about important figures of African diasporic origin, not only in Cuba, but also in the United States. It was Mamota who told Leon about Josephine Baker, Marian Anderson, and Paul Robeson, musicians Leon would eventually collaborate with in one way or another. Quote. What I realized today, Leon concludes, is that she was creating a consciousness in me. She wanted me to realize that they were musicians of color and they had gone to Europe and had conquered the world. It is like she was trying to tell me, if they did it, you can also do it. End of quote. These experiences would seemingly confirm what Walker Hill and Watkins say about Leon. She grew up unaware of the history of abuse of blacks in the United States, which prevented her from empathizing with their sense of belittlement. Nevertheless, Leon has made clear that she understood very well why African Americans avoided looking white people in the eye. Let us explore the experiences that inform such a statement. When Leon left Cuba, the Castro regime was engaged in a propaganda war against the United States. As part of that battle, images of the repression of the civil rights movement in the United States were common in Cuban television. Mamota, who didn't want her granddaughter to leave Cuba, emphasized the racial abuse blacks had to face in the United States that was awaiting her. So when Leon arrived in New York and saw what was going on, she panicked, and I quote, "It was true that what my grandmother told me," she recalls thinking, "but they were talking about in Cuban television because the year I arrived was when they allowed people of two different races to get married. I started watching Martin Luther King's marches on TV, all of those things with the dogs and repression with police clubs. So I thought, oh my God, it was true. Everything I heard back in Cuba was true. I thought it was all propaganda, but no, it was true." End of quote. Leon was horrified by what she learned, but her experience did not end there. Racism was something she experienced in her own life and witnessed on a daily basis where she lived and worked. But the fact was that she was offered a job with Dance Theater of Harlem almost as soon as she arrived in the United States, and subsequently was involved with many African-American projects during those early years in the United States, was an immense educational experience concerning the politics of African-American identity at the time. These were spaces where she could enter into those conversations about racism, given her direct contact with many of the activists who were fighting those fights. Martha Mook, who was Leon's partner for almost 3 decades, puts the composer's experience of institutional racism in the United States vis-a-vis a more personal perspective, and I quote, "With her, I got into situations where I got to see something I would never have known about otherwise because of the color of my skin and the color of my eyes." Martha is a white Jewish woman from a Polish background. Going into a store and being followed, or having the perception of being followed by a store worker, or being stopped in the car, I have seen it enough and I have to respect that. I did see a police officer give her a hard time for no reason. I know she's worked extremely hard and had a lot of doors slam in her face, and a lot of people tell her, "You will never make it because of the color of your skin or the accent or your music or whatever." And she has overcome all of that to be where she is today. End of quote. Colleagues and students also witnessed Leon dealing with racism in the workplace. Jason Stanjek, who was Leon's undergraduate composition student in the late 1980s, witnessed instances of racism against her at Brooklyn College. And I quote Jason, "I have distinct memories of particular professors speaking disparagingly about her and just be blunt racist. I had a professor who never stopped talking crap about her. And it was quite obvious that even to an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, that was racist. You know, the kind of language he used. I remember distinctly him not being happy about her being a composition professor at the university that he had been at for a long time." End of quote. Leon has also discussed how those instances of racism affected her work at Brooklyn College and the students' curricular offerings. Quote, "One day I was in a classroom by myself grading exams when a professor came in and told me that he believed they had given me the position for my color and not my talent. So I exploded in a faculty meeting and told them I was not going to put up with those things. Then when Dorothy Klossman stopped conducting the conservatory orchestra, she left it to me. And I invited Tan Dun, David Lang, Chen Yi, Pauline Oliveros, Philip Glass. We played their music. But then I had to go to Germany to conduct my opera in 1994. And they gave the orchestra to this man, the same man who made my life miserable there. They didn't want to give the orchestra back to me, even though I had just received this big award for my opera, because this guy said that there was too much contemporary music. And when students complained that there was not enough contemporary music, the answer was that this guy was going to have the orchestra until he retired. End of quote. Harold Oja, Leon's colleague at Brooklyn College from 1988 to 1997, considers that this particular faculty member may have felt threatened by, quote unquote, Tanya's musicianship and talent in the body of an Afro-Cuban woman. It was just hard for him to handle, and he did the best over the years to make sure that she conducted the orchestra as little as possible. That she was just kind of kept from fully functioning in those worlds, especially with the orchestra. End of quote. In a more general impression of her former colleagues dealing with racism, Oja adds that she had seen many times how white people try to, quote, keep her in her place. She is permitted to sit at the banquet, but she has a seat way down at the end of the table and not really probably even given a full meal. And yet she speaks up, and of course this causes irritation. End of quote. Years later, upon reflecting on the university's systematic lack of recognition of Leon's work and the unnecessary obstacles she had to face there, retired faculty member Wiley Hitchcock confided to newly hired Professor Eli Hisama his sadness that Brooklyn College never, quote, realized what they had with Tanya, end of quote. Leon has a deep knowledge and understanding of the quote unquote Black American world that Walker Hill invokes in her book's introduction. She had been an important part of many cultural projects that have been central to the confirmation of that world, and has also individually experienced the structural prejudices that have belittled African Americans for many generations. Nevertheless, she has chosen to deal with these issues in a different way, refusing to be identified solely by a single identitarian experience. But it is this experience of racism and this systematic reproduction in the reaction of her work with a variety of African-American artistic projects that informed her transition into the culture of the United States, her adoptive country. Arthur Mitchell explained it succinctly when he said he quote, understood what she was fighting for all this time because we were fighting for the same thing. End of quote, and thank you. So any questions, comments?
I have a question. I mean, it seems to me that what really the point for Tanya Leon was not to want her professional identities and different personal identities to be collided in the same place, right? That it's not that she felt that she wasn't African American, or that she wasn't black, or she wasn't a woman, but that she didn't want to be recognized as a black composer or a woman composer, or kind of collision and colliding and superseding, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, but it's not only about her personal.
But I guess what I'm asking is, it seems like what I think you are doing in this new book that I have not seen is that the political choices that she wants to make are different, right? Maybe more so than her identities themselves. Is that a fair way to understand that?
I think the issue is here, the question of identities, actually. So you mentioned that maybe this is something that was colliding her personal identity with her professional identity, but I think it goes beyond that. He sees herself as not having any of these identities, or these being just partial identities that are not her complete self. And in the portion of the interview that we published in the book, she actually speaks about that, and she said, this is my body, and I just have this body that happens to be black and happens to be a woman, and this is my, how I present myself to the world, how I walk the world. No? But this is only that. I am more than that. No? And I think it's about that fragmentation that she's trying to fight against.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Alejandro, I love hearing your talk about Tanya because it reminds me a lot of experiences of some of the Cuban musicians that I work with in New York Jazz and so my question is about the discrimination that she experienced and isolation. And you mentioned her female partner, but her sexual identity is never sort of one of the reasons that you mentioned, and at least in this paper about for which she might have been discriminated against or. So I was just wondering if that has come up in your research or if you have talked about that. It seems it was interesting that it wasn't mentioned already.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because she actually, I mean, the situation was kind of difficult when I was writing about her because that was the moment when they broke.
Oh.
And she told me that she didn't want her to be so prominent in those chapters that I was thinking about Martha. So it was difficult to deal with. She also didn't want to openly say that she was lesbian because she doesn't identify as lesbian. She said that she happened to have that partner, no? And she happened to love that person who happened to be a woman. No? So in terms of identifying, I don't think that issue is something that she has actually made public. No, that if that was a source of discrimination, it might have. She never spoke about that to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she might not identify, but other people.
Maybe, although I'm not sure that a lot of people knew about it.
Yeah.
I kind of knew, and it was interesting because when I was interviewing her at some point, like the second or third interview, Martha was living there, but she didn't really come down when I was there until like the third interview. And she said, Tanya told me, I want to introduce you to Martha. And I'm okay. So Martha, actually, I was like, no, Martha might be someone really important in your life if she wants to introduce me to her, right? So it sort of confirmed some of the rumors that I had heard, but it was really never open. Mark?
Thanks so much for this. Also, I was reading the interview transcript, and so it's great to hear your, the excerpt from the chapter that dovetails with that. I understand the idea that she's trying to get away from identity categories, right? In the interview you have here, and I've heard her say this elsewhere too, she sometimes says, I'm the spirit that happens to be in this body. I wonder if you ever think that she needs something more sort of spiritual or religious, or what's her sort of worldview when she's talking about spirit?
Yeah, it does, but it also is nothing. It's not nothing that refers to any sort of institutionalized religion, not even Afro-Cuban religion. I mean, she speaks about all of that, and she embraces it as part of her cultural background. But she is very clear to say, but I'm not a believer of Orisha. Although, I mean, it's a very strong presence in her family life. But she said, I was never inducted, I was not part of it, I was just an bystander who witnessed all of that. And I think she said that about many of sort of her experience in terms of spirituality. So it's a sort of a very personal one that doesn't really align with any particular religion. But it's a very strong presence and part of her identity. Thanks a lot.